Hello, church family, and welcome to today's Sunday school lesson. We are in session 10 entitled Why Listen? And our key idea this week is the wise person heeds the warnings gained from past mistakes and godly counselors. And we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 13 through chapter 5, verse 7. And we're going to start today off by asking the question, what lessons from history do people rely on when living today? Why might a person ignore history and the lessons to be learned? And there are countless and plentiful examples from history that governments around the world use to keep from repeating history. The one that is on my mind the most is what happened during the Holocaust, during World War II. And there are things now in place to keep certain nations from gaining so much power as Germany did and Austria did in World War II, that allowed them to commit such atrocities like the Holocaust and the genocide that happened there. And so we've learned from that mistake, I think, collectively as a world. And there are some people who would like to think that the Holocaust didn't happen. And in fact, there are people who ignore history and fact and say that it is actually just a made-up conspiracy, that it never happened. And so that's a case where somebody is ignoring history and a lesson to be learned through that. And they do that because they just can't bring themselves to see how something so awful could have happened, or they think they know better and can do better, and don't want to rely on the mistakes of people who came before them. So some context for this morning. We are, again, reading the words of King Solomon here. He wrote them as a record of his search for meaning in life. He is looking for, why do we do what we do? Why do we slave and work so hard on earth for things that we can't take with us into heaven? And so in his search for the meaning of life, Solomon discovered life only makes sense when one acknowledges God. Otherwise, it is all nonsense. For example, while it is impossible for fallen humans living in a fallen world to understand the various seasons of life and all the activities that accompany these seasons, people should recognize that God in his sovereignty has appointed all of them, and that they are appropriate to his purpose. So what is God's purpose? God's purpose is to call mankind back into redemption to himself. That's part of it, but really the bigger overarching purpose is for God to be glorified. That is what God exists for, is for his own glorification. And that's what we exist for, is his glorification. But what God does to accomplish that is by seeking a lost humanity. And we see it from cover to cover of the Bible, that God is seeking after mankind over and over and over again, and ultimately wins mankind, or at least wins the souls of those who will choose him through his son Jesus. So let's go ahead and get into our text today. I'm going to go ahead and read for us, and this is in chapter 4 and going into verse 5, or chapter 5 rather. Better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer pays attention to warnings. For he came from prison to be king, that's the poor man, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who move about under the sun follow a second youth who succeeds him. There is no limit to all the people who were before them, yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Better to approach in obedience than to offer the sacrifices fools do, for they ignorantly do wrong. Do not be hasty to speak, and do not be impulsive to make a speech before God. God is in heaven, and you are on earth, so let your words be few. Just as dreams accompany much labor, so also a fool's voice comes with many words. When you make a vow to God, don't delay fulfilling it, because he does not delight in fools. Fulfill what you vow. Better that you do not vow than that you vow and do not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth bring guilt on you, and do not say in the presence of the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry with your words and destroy the work of your hands? For many dreams bring futility, so do many words. Therefore, fear God. So we're going to take a look at a contrast between two individuals here, a poor youth and an poor but wise youth and an old but foolish king. And we're going to look at verses 13 through 16, which this section of our outline is entitled When Leading. So it's going to be talking about when we are in leadership, when we're in places of authority. This is a good, just a good example for us and a good lesson for us here. Better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer pays attention to warnings. For he came from prison to be king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who move about under the sun follow a second youth who succeeds him. There is no limit to all the people who were before them, yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. So we're looking at these two people. One is a poor but wise person and a young person at that, and the other one is an old but foolish king who isn't listening to anything. And we can see here that the youth has characteristics that make him a teachable person, and that wisdom that he has, and that his lack of authority here, because he is poor and out of prison, he is one who is teachable. He can't do things for himself, and we need to ask the question: what are the characteristics of teachable people, and how does one develop a teachable spirit? And honestly, it's just being humble enough to listen to people who know more than us, or are wiser than us, or have lived longer than us, and just frankly know more than us. But also it is a spirit of understanding that we don't know everything. And we will say, the youth tend to know everything from about the ages of 14 to 21, or in my case 24. Still now at 27, I still think I know everything. And there's an adage that until your kids are 13 or 14 years old, you know everything. You as the parent know everything. But when they hit 13 or 14 years old, then they know everything until about their mid-20s, and then you know everything again because they're coming back for your advice. So how do we develop that teachable spirit? And it's by acknowledging that we don't know everything on our own, that we have to gain knowledge from somewhere, and it can't be ourselves. Knowledge can never be something that we attain through our own sitting around and thinking. It has to come from an outside source, normally through others around us. So the teacher, Solomon, witnessed a second youth who succeeded the first young man who had replaced the old foolish king. The people who once adored the first young man who became king now followed his successor. So the cycle of there was an old foolish king, people didn't like him. There was a young man who became the king, and he was king for a long time, and everyone seemed to like him. And then the second young man became king, and then everyone stopped following the second man, the first young man, and started following the second. And there's this cycle there that people will follow the new thing over and over again, and it's always been that way. And we see that cycle described by Solomon in today's world by the passage of presidents. Or passage of people in authority, passages of music, even where we all like the music that we liked when we were kids. There's saying where the music that you listened to when you were 14 years old is the music that you will still enjoy from your adulthood on. And it's true. I listen to, sometimes a song will come on that was on the radio when I was in the 8th grade, and I go, man, this is a great song. And, people around me, especially my youngest sister, Carly, will look at me like I'm, a goofball, and that I don't know what good music is because my music is old to her. So let's continue reading here, verses, now in chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. This is talking about when worshiping. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Better to approach in obedience than to offer the sacrifice as fools do, for they ignorantly do wrong. Do not be hasty to speak, and do not be impulsive to make a speech before God. God is in heaven, and you are on earth, so let your words be few. Just as dreams accompany much labor, so also a fool's voice comes with many words. So here in verse 2, we have an idea, this do not be hasty to speak. James actually echoes this exact same thought here in his book when he says, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. That's in James chapter 5, verse 12. And Solomon is kind of saying the same thing. Don't just make empty promises to the Lord or to others, because you will be held accountable to those vows. So why are we as worshipers prone to approach God with meaningless rituals instead of hearts for obedience? Well, you'll hear often people say, I have to get my life right with Christ. I have to clean up my act before I can come to church. I have to do all these things. You'll hear people say, God, if you could, I will go back to church and I will give so much money to the church, yada, yada, if you will do this one thing for me. And then God, of course, will be faithful and gracious and do that one thing for them. And you'll never see them step foot inside of the church. You'll never see a cent. This church will never see a cent from them. And it's a meaningless ritual to them to try to get something that they want, because they've reached a point of desperation and hubris, maybe, where they're thinking that, well, there's no way God will actually make this happen, but I don't have anywhere else to turn. And every now and then you'll get somebody who will be faithful and take that seriously. But I think more often than not, we as humans tend to make outlandish promises. We tend to overpromise and underdeliver, when it should be, in Solomon's words, we should just not make vows, because why should God be angry with our words and destroy the work of our hands because we said something out of haste? There is a story in the Bible where a man says, God, if you give us, if you do this one thing for me, I don't remember exactly what it was, but if you do this thing for me, I will sacrifice the next thing I lay eyes on. And the next thing he saw was his daughter climbing out of his tent. And so he sacrificed his daughter to the Lord because that was the vow he made, and it was foolish. And it's just a sad story all the way around, because he was hasty in his speech. And so Solomon is warning us about that. So God never required anyone to make a vow to him. Therefore, failing to keep a voluntary vow to the Lord in his house was a serious offense and equated to breaking the third commandment, which forbids the misuse of the Lord's name, taking the Lord's name in vain. So let us ask the question, what does the expectation of keeping a vow made to God reveal about the true nature of worship? How does this expectation relate to the character of God? Well, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, that we need to present our bodies as living sacrifices that are holy and acceptable unto the Lord. That doing that is our spiritual act of worship. And so if we are going to offer up our bodies, if we are going to be living sacrifices, that means that when we don't fulfill a vow that we make voluntarily, that we're not fully realizing the weight of what was done for us, and kind of laughing and insulting the Lord on his faithfulness to us to fulfill his promises to us. And so it's important for us to realize that words have power and words have meaning. And when we say things to the Lord, we need to mean them, and we need to make sure that we're saying things that are true, that things that are contrite from our heart, and also things that are acceptable to him. And that is just a mirror image of God's holiness, because God can't accept anything less than holy. And the only way that we can be holy is by relying on Christ. And so by saying things that are lies, essentially, if you break a promise, you're essentially lying. I would consider that to be a lie. Then it's not worship, and it's not acceptable worship. And so it will make it's an insult to the Lord and his character, I think, to hastily rush into a vow or a promise that we cannot keep. So let's go ahead and look at the last little section here, when promising. And this is verses 4 through 7. When you make a vow to God, don't delay fulfilling it, because he does not delight in fools. Fulfill what you vow. Better that you do not vow than that you vow and do not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth bring guilt on you, and do not say in the presence of the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry with your words and destroy the work of your hands? For many dreams bring futility, and so do many words. Therefore, fear God. Again, this idea of not making a empty vow or an empty promise to the Lord is an act of fearing the Lord by not rushing into things. If we rush into it, you're really showing that you really aren't fearing the Lord. You're not respecting him and giving him the glory and praise that he deserves and the respect he deserves by being reverent in his house. So I think that our last question here is, why is it better to refrain from making a vow to God than making a vow and not keeping it? And like I said, it just is disrespectful to the Lord. So this Sunday morning, we are going to be taking the Lord's Supper, and Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians to not take the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner by not doing something too hastily. And so as we leave our lesson from this morning and go into worship, I pray that you will take this into account, that you won't make any hasty vows to the Lord, you won't be hasty in receiving the Lord's Supper, but that you will make sure that you are presenting your body as a living sacrifice and making sure that your worship is acceptable this morning.